There is one man standing against 54 other European football federations right now, and his name is David Trunda. While the rest of Europe is in open revolt against FIFA, the president of the Czech Football Association just went on record backing Gianni Infantino's plan to sell a piece of the World Cup itself to private investors. A plan UEFA says crosses a line football's governing institutions should never cross. A plan the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has publicly condemned. A plan that's got UEFA seriously discussing whether to boycott FIFA competitions altogether. And in the middle of all that, one Czech football executive looked at the biggest financial controversy football has seen in years and said, essentially, count me in. Today, we're breaking down exactly what this plan is, why it's triggered what might be the most serious institutional revolt FIFA has faced in its modern history, and why Trunda's decision to break ranks matters a lot more than one small federation's opinion should. If you've been following this channel through the World Cup, you already know FIFA's credibility has been under fire for months. The Balogun red card reversal, the congressional investigation into Infantino, the European backlash that followed. This story is different. This isn't about one match or one decision. This is about who actually owns football. And Infantino just tried to answer that question in a way that's terrified almost everyone. Let's start with what actually happened. Earlier this week, it emerged that Gianni Infantino has been developing a plan to sell a significant stake in FIFA's commercial operations to private investors. The vehicle for this is a newly announced entity called FIFA Forward Enterprise, or FFE. The idea is to spin off FIFA's commercial rights, broadcast deals, sponsorship, ticketing, licensing, along with the operational running of FIFA's tournaments, including the Men's and Women's World Cup, into this new corporate structure. FIFA says FFE would raise up to $4.2 billion, based on an initial valuation of the whole enterprise at $20 billion, by selling minority, non-controlling stakes to a small group of long-term investors. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. According to reporting from The Times, each of FIFA's 211 member associations would be offered a stake in this new company worth around $20 million, money they could either hold on to or cash out for immediate income. On the surface, that sounds like FIFA sharing the wealth. Free money for federations, including plenty of smaller ones that desperately need funding for grassroots programs and infrastructure. But look at the fine print, because this is where pure bribery isn't my phrase. It's a direct quote from an anonymous senior football figure speaking to The Times. FIFA has reportedly told its member associations that if they don't sign on to this plan by September 19th, they'll only receive a fraction of that promised $40 million windfall instead of the full amount. In other words, agree fast or lose most of the money. That's not really an investment offer at that point. That's leverage, a financial incentive with a countdown clock attached, aimed at pressuring cash-strapped federations into signing before they've had time to properly examine what they're actually agreeing to. And there's more in the fine print that's raising eyebrows. Reports indicate the investors lined up to buy into this new entity include Thrive Eternal, a firm launched by Joshua Kushner, whose brother, Jared Kushner, is married to Ivanka Trump, making him a son-in-law of President Trump. If that name rings a bell, it should. Trump's relationship with Infantino has already been under a congressional microscope over the Balogun red card reversal during the World Cup. Now, there's a Kushner family-linked investment vehicle potentially buying into FIFA's actual commercial infrastructure. You can see immediately why this plan isn't landing as a neutral business decision to the people scrutinizing it. There's also a personal wrinkle that's fueling suspicion about Infantino's motives. The Times reported that Infantino is preparing to lead this new company as a commissioner once his final term as FIFA president ends, and that he's expected to be re-elected unopposed through 2031 in the meantime. Multiple anonymous sources describe this as creating what they called unacceptable conflicts of interest, a sitting FIFA president effectively setting up his own soft landing into a lucrative commercial role, using an entity built from assets that by many people's reading belong to football as a whole, rather than to Infantino personally. Now let's talk about the reaction, because it's been fast and it's been furious. UEFA came out almost immediately with a statement that didn't hold back. They said the plan crosses a line that football's governing institutions should never cross, and added something that's since become the defining quote of this entire controversy. The soul and governance of football are not assets to trade, especially with zero transparency as to who gains financially. UEFA's closing line was blunt. None of us are the owners of football. It is not FIFA's to sell. CONCACAF, the North American Confederation, also expressed outrage. The English FA released a statement saying it was deeply concerned about the lack of process and governance behind the plan, along with what it called the apparent substance and principles involved, and made clear that once the full proposals actually shared transparently, they'll make their views clear. It didn't stop at football institutions either. UK Prime Minister Andy Burnham became the first major world leader to publicly condemn the plan, posting that football does not belong to investors. When a sitting head of government is weighing in directly on a FIFA commercial restructuring plan, you know the reaction has gone well beyond football's usual internal politics. And here's how seriously UEFA is taking this. Sources told ESPN there's strong internal opposition building within UEFA, and that a virtual meeting of all 55 European member associations was being planned for this week, specifically to present a united front against Infantino's plan. There's even boycott talk in the air. This isn't the first time. Back in 2021, FIFA abandoned a proposal to hold the World Cup every 2 years, specifically because UEFA threatened a boycott. And multiple sources now believe that same threat is back on the table if FIFA pushes forward with FFE. Think about the scale of that for a second. We're talking about the possibility of Europe, the continent that produces the most valuable clubs, the biggest broadcast deals, and arguably the deepest talent pool in world football, potentially withdrawing its national teams from FIFA competitions entirely. That's not a symbolic gesture. That's an existential threat to the World Cup as a product, because a World Cup without European teams isn't really the World Cup anymore. This isn't the first time Infantino has tried something like this. Back in 2018, he proposed a sequestered $25 billion deal over 12 years with Japan's SoftBank to create new global competitions, reportedly backed by Saudi Arabian money as well. That plan collapsed after fierce resistance from UEFA, which saw it as a direct threat to its own crown jewels, the Champions League and the European Championship. In 2019, a FIFA Stakeholders Committee formally rejected a similar $25 billion private investment plan for an expanded Club World Cup. So this is now the third time in less than a decade that Infantino has tried to bring large-scale private investment into FIFA's core competitions, and the third time UEFA has stood directly in his way. The difference this time is the scale. $20 billion is a bigger number than anything proposed before, and the fact that it's tied directly to ownership of the World Cup's commercial rights specifically, not just a new secondary tournament nobody was emotionally attached to yet. Which brings us back to David Trunda. Trunda was elected president of the Czech Football Association a little over a year ago. He previously ran Slavia Prague and currently owns FK Mlada Boleslav. So this isn't someone new to the business side of football. He understands exactly what he's evaluating here. And in an interview with Sky News, he broke from what's become an overwhelming wall of European opposition, saying the $20 billion plan would provide valuable additional funding to support grassroots football and infrastructure development back home in the Czech Republic. What makes his position notable isn't just that he supports the plan. It's how isolated that makes him. According to Sky News, amid what they described as a tsunami of opposition to FIFA's proposal, very few senior football figures anywhere have spoken out in support, making Trunda something of an outlier. He's not some rogue actor trying to burn bridges with UEFA either. He specifically described UEFA as, in his words, a very important partner, and said that in his time in charge, every project he's experienced in cooperation with FIFA has been very positive for the development of European football. So Trunda isn't rejecting UEFA. He's just making a calculated bet that for a smaller federation like Czechia's, the direct financial upside from FIFA's plan is worth more than the institutional solidarity UEFA is asking for. And that's actually the most revealing part of this whole story, because it exposes exactly the dynamic critics are worried about. If FIFA can find even a handful of smaller federations willing to break ranks in exchange for guaranteed money, especially with a hard deadline attached, that undermines the united front UEFA is trying to build. FIFA doesn't need every federation on board. It needs enough votes. And remember, the plan is subject to approval by a majority of FIFA's 211 national associations, along with FIFA's 37-member council. Most of those 211 federations are considerably smaller and more cash-strapped than the biggest European nations. For a federation with limited government funding and years of underinvestment in grassroots infrastructure, a guaranteed $20 million payout, with a real risk of losing most of it if they wait past September 19th, is an incredibly powerful incentive, regardless of how the bigger political story around Kushner-linked investors or Infantino's future role looks from London or Brussels. That's the mechanism critics are the most worried about. It's not really about whether UEFA's 55 members vote no. It's about whether FIFA can quietly assemble a majority from the rest of the world, federation by federation, using exactly the kind of financial pressure Trunda's decision demonstrates actually works. There's also a broader pattern worth mentioning, because this isn't happening in isolation from Infantino's other controversial pushes. He's previously floated reviving the idea of a biennial World Cup, a tournament every 2 years instead of 4, an idea that was met with fierce opposition from UEFA, CONMEBOL, and even the International Olympic Committee when it was first proposed. Infantino was criticized at the time for comments he made trying to sell that plan, where he suggested a more frequent World Cup would give what he called hope to Africans, so they wouldn't need to risk their lives crossing the sea. Remarks widely condemned as tone deaf, which he later tried to walk back. Multiple IOC members reportedly criticized his plans directly during an official session, to the point where the IOC president had to ask people to stop piling on. I mentioned that history because it shows a consistent pattern with Infantino specifically, repeatedly proposing large-scale commercial restructurings of football's biggest assets, repeatedly facing fierce institutional resistance from Europe and South America, and repeatedly trying again anyway with a bigger number attached. $25 billion in 2018, $25 billion again in 2019, now $20 billion in valuation for FFE. The specific vehicle keeps changing. The core instinct, bring in outside capital, centralize more commercial control, offer federations money to get their buy-in, hasn't. So where does this actually go from here? FIFA has set September 19th as the effective deadline for member associations to sign on for the full $40 million payout. That gives UEFA a real hard timeline to organize opposition before financial pressure starts peeling away individual federations one by one, exactly the dynamic Trunda's early support already shows is possible. Watch for the outcome of that emergency meeting of the 55 European associations, whether they emerge with an actual unified boycott threat, or whether cracks like Trunda's start appearing elsewhere in Europe too. Watch whether CONCACAF's outrage translates into a formal position or stays at the level of a statement. And watch whether other world leaders follow Andy Burnham's lead in publicly weighing in, because political pressure on a private commercial deal is unusual, and it signals just how far outside normal football politics this controversy has already traveled. There's also a legal and governance question hovering over all of this that hasn't been fully answered yet. UEFA's own language that football's soul and governance are not FIFA's to sell isn't just rhetoric. FIFA is legally structured as a Swiss-based not-for-profit association owned collectively by its member federations. Whether Infantino actually has the authority to spin off the World Cup's commercial rights into a for-profit entity he'd later help run without what critics call proper transparency about who the investors are and what they'd control is exactly the kind of governance dispute that could end up contested well beyond football's own internal politics. Here's the honest bottom line. FIFA is trying to do something it's attempted twice before and failed both times, bring massive outside private capital into the heart of its commercial operations. Except this time the number is bigger, the political names attached are more explosive, and the backlash from Europe's football establishment has been faster and louder than anything Infantino has faced on this specific issue before. Against all of that, one Czech Federation president looked at the numbers for his own country and decided the money was worth the isolation. Whether Trunda ends up looking like a smart early mover who cashed in while everyone else was posturing, or the first domino in a plan that quietly wins over just enough small federations to pass despite UEFA's fury, that's the story we're all about to watch play out over the next several weeks. Let me know in the comments what you think happens by September 19th. Does UEFA actually organize a real boycott, or does FIFA's money talk louder than the outrage? And do you think Trunda made the right call for Czech football, even if it means standing against almost everyone else in Europe?